Welcome to the theEWpodcast. I'm your host, Eric White. So today's guest is Jonathan Rowson. Here's a quick bio I pulled from the internet about Jonathan. Jonathan is co-founder and director of Perspectiva. He was previously director of the Social Brain Center at the RSA, where he authored a range of influential research reports on behavior change, climate change, and spirituality, and curated and chaired a range of related events. Jonathan is an applied philosopher with degrees from Oxford, Harvard, and Bristol Universities. In a former life, he was a Chess Grandmaster and British Champion, and views the game as a continuing source of insight and inspiration. His book, The Moves That Matter, A Chess Grandmaster on the Game of Life, was published by Bloomsbury in 2019. After recording this conversation, Jonathan also released an essay through his organization Perspectiva titled Tasting the Pickle, 10 Flavors of Metacrisis and the Appetite for a New Civilization. So I highly recommend checking out both the essay and the book that Jonathan has written. I've linked to both of these in the show notes. Jonathan is really a fantastic writer. He does a great job of humanizing larger ideas. The book draws on themes like strategy, sacrifice, hard work, and it's all humanized through his own experience as a chess competitor. The same is true of the essay that I just mentioned. In the essay, he lays out a few of the major existential crises facing our planet, and again, does a great job of humanizing them and really makes his ideas accessible to people who may not be familiar with the topics he's talking about. So I think that's all I'm going to say here. I hope you enjoy this episode, and don't forget to check out the show notes. So without further ado, here is my conversation with Jonathan Rowson. All right, well, I'm here with Jonathan Rowson, Chess Grandmaster, philosopher, co-founder of the research institute Perspectiva, and author of a number of books, including The Moves That Matter, A Chess Grandmaster on the Game of Life. Thanks for joining me, Jonathan. I really appreciate you and your time.
It's a pleasure to be here, Eric.
Cool. So there's a lot we could talk about. You have an interesting life. There's a lot of things in your book worth talking about. Perspectiva, of course, is something I'm interested in. But maybe we can just start with, how does someone who has such a deep background in chess, which to me is a very analytical, logical, almost scientific endeavor, get into a more spiritual realm?
In some ways, the whole book is an answer to that question. You could say, I want to use a sort of analogy in philosophy, that people often think of philosophy, particularly analytic philosophy, as being something about conceptual analysis and reason. But really, at the heart of it is exploring and experiencing the boundaries of that reason and the boundaries of that rationality. Likewise with chess, yes, there's a lot going on in those 64 squares and those 32 pieces. A near infinity of possibilities there. But in some ways, it's when you try and make meaning out of that game for many years, and you suddenly realize that actually it's not where it's at, that somehow you have to look elsewhere. So I think one way of answering this is that I didn't ever come to chess as a kind of mathematically minded, hyper-logical, hyper-rational person. I came because there was something about the nature of the game that allowed me to forget myself and sublimate whatever else I was going through at the time, which in my case was, parental separation and family members becoming mentally unwell and moving home a few times, and just the growing pains of adolescence, broadly conceived. And chess was a way to place that in some kind of perspective. And when I say perspective, I really mean it gave a kind of metaphorical and symbolic way of representing some of the feelings I was going through. So themes of sacrifice and defense and attack and exchanging and relationships, these are all very, very abstracted notions compared to real life. But somehow that world made enough sense for me that it allowed me to grow up and create a sort of viable adulthood somehow. And also, the other thing to say about chess just is to disabuse the idea that it's entirely about logic and reason, because if you in some of my previous books on chess, I've written a lot about the narrative quality of the game, that actually when you begin to analyze your games and look deeply at what it takes to play well and how things go wrong, the narrative quality of how we make sense of positions is quite striking. So the problem people find is they get caught up in a narrative, a story about the game, a story about what's going to happen, what has happened, what's important, what's not important. And that story kind of holds them captive, such that when something arises that they can't fit into that story, they can't even see it sometimes, or they don't take it seriously. And so that, for me, is a little bit like real life too, that we get caught up in our narratives. And if spirituality means, well, it means many things, but one of the things it's about is having some kind of critical, reflective, experiential relationship to the stories we're caught up in, so that we have the stories rather than being had by them.
That's interesting. Yeah, I like in your book, I should just let you know I'm not a huge chess player. I'm actually not a chess player at all.
Congratulations. No, seriously. Like I don't worry. I've lived my whole life with people apologizing for not being chess players. There's really nothing to apologize for at all.
Yeah, but that's like one of the things that I've really enjoyed about reading your book is that you don't need to have a serious background in chess to understand it. You make, whenever you use chess to make your points, you explain things very well, but you're constantly drawing on things from the real world that most people will be able to relate to, that I think gives it a lot of texture.
I hope so. I mean, to be honest, I feel it was very much written for a general audience. I mean, it's almost a critique of the chess world. I mean, there's a lot of love of chess in there, as you can probably discern. And I still love the game, and I'm very grateful for all that it's given me. But there is a sense of it being a kind of fond farewell too. I haven't played competitively for about a decade. And I feel, chess was a wonderful vehicle for one stage of my life. But I also feel that there is more to life. And so in a way, this book was sort of trying to make sense of that obsessive quality, trying to make sense of what it's like to get lost in the game, but then also what it means to move beyond it, because that's true of almost any endeavor, whether it's gaming or sport or art or music. It's quite good at some phase of your life to get really lost in something, even obsessed by it. Mm-hmm. But it's also good not to stay there, So the book's really wrestling with that twin energy of complete absorption in something and then sort of somehow disembedding yourself from it.
Is that what you meant earlier when you said that chess was not where it's at? You had to look somewhere else. You mean that it couldn't be a purpose for living? Is that kind of what you meant?
I think there's a kind of confidence trick involved with almost any sporting contest, and chess is there's another question there of whether chess is technically a sport or not. That's for another day. But anything where you're obliged to sort of enter into a competitive spectacle and a rule-governed activity and say, what I'm about to do is really important, right? You've got to buy into that story. These pieces, I have to marshal them with all my strength and guile. I have to resist the opponent's advances. I have to outthink them. I have to endure over several hours, and I have to eventually prevail. And it really matters, right? Mm-hmm. You've got to believe that. You've got to buy into that story. And what happened in my case was I bought into that story for many years, until I would say I was about, late 20s, it began to break a bit. And then by sort of early to mid 30s, when I was becoming a father and keen to do other things, it really broke down completely. And I think the way I see it now is that chess is I still feel it's very, very, very interesting, but I can no longer say I feel it's very important. That's a distinction I would make, that interesting, absolutely. Important, tell me the context, tell me the person, tell me what's going on, and I'll tell you whether it's important or not.
Fair enough. So I'm assuming then that Perspectiva better represents what you believe to be an important focus of your efforts. Is that fair?
Yeah, I think I moved along at some point around about, let's see, around about 2010, 2011, I was working at the Royal Society of Arts in London. And two things happened simultaneously for me professionally. So I don't know, for your listeners, I don't know how best to contextualize this, but in essence, I was working on behavior change. So to back up slightly, around 2008, I was still playing quite a lot of chess. I finished my PhD. And then 2009, I think, I was looking for jobs, trying to escape chess. But it's not easy to escape chess because it's a free life. You know, if you're quite good at it, you travel a lot, you do what you love, you usually make enough money to survive. Maybe not always much more than that, but if you're good, you can get by. And there's a growing community now, and the internet's made it even bigger. So it wasn't easy to let it go, but inside, I just felt I wasn't growing anymore. I wasn't learning enough on a sort of week by week basis to want to keep going. And so what happened was I used some of my educational background. I had studied politics, philosophy, and economics at Oxford back in the day, and then I did a master's degree at Harvard for a while on sort of psychology and neuroscience. And then a few years later, I did a PhD on what it means to become wiser. And then it wasn't obvious where any of that was going. That was always kind of plan B while I was playing chess. But then this job came up about social networks in deprived communities. And it didn't look like me at all. But my wife, Shiva, said, you should consider this because it's an interesting organization and you might get the job and you might find your way within it. And so that's kind of what I did. I applied, I put my strongest case forward, the interview went well. And within a few months of that job, I actually was shifted internally to work on what was called the Social Brain Project. And I developed a certain talent for fundraising and raised some funds, and it became the Social Brain Center. And that brings me to your question, which is at that moment, the projects that I wanted to do, I was really interested in climate change. It became like, okay, what do we do about this big, massive global collective action problem? But I was also very intrigued by the nature of the conversations around me. So this is kind of a public policy environment. So we're based in quite close to Westminster in central London. Lots of conversations about well-being, about economic growth, about social policy. But I noticed something very interesting about these discourses, if you like, which is that they always stopped somewhere. They never pushed themselves to the final point in my mind. So you'd get to well-being, but you'd never get to sort of flourishing, or you'd never get to the meaning of life. You would get to something like solidarity, but you wouldn't speak about friendship. You would get to, something about spending time with a social contact, or what's the quality of your social network, but you wouldn't speak about love, So there was something about the interiority was missing in a lot of public policy conversations. And that was true also of climate change, where it felt like all the talk was about carbon taxes and global scientific targets. And I started to think something's missing here. So I managed to raise funds for a project on, the public perception of spirituality, and particularly trying to look at theories of human nature that might better situate what spirituality might mean, because it can be quite a fluffy, vague, and ambiguous concept. And that worked. And around the same time, I was doing work on climate change. So Perspectiva can be seen as the kind of emergent property of, how do we speak about fundamental questions together, and how do we deal with our biggest problems together? And yet those conversations were not joining up. So I thought, let's create the organization that does that. And I was lucky at that time to meet the co-founder, Thomas Bjorkman, who was having similar thoughts, and together we made Perspectiva.
So if I'm getting this correctly, then it would be your belief that to solve these larger existential crises like climate change, we need to be focused on individual well-being and individual flourishing, as you've said?
No, not quite. So it's like this. What is the boundary of the inquiry? What are the perimeters of it? What are the edges of it? Try and ask yourself that. So if you're interested in a problem like climate change, and how we describe these things matters. So maybe it's not climate change, maybe it's climate crisis, maybe it's climate collapse. It may not be a problem, it might be a predicament, but whatever we decide to call it, if we're thinking about the predicament of incipient climate collapse, let's say, I'm not saying the challenge is for everyone to be well at all. If anything, I actually think it's deeper than that. I think there's something about reckoning with the fact that, in one sense, we've already failed. We've left dealing with the problem at a global level much later than we should have done. Now, that's not a call to despair. It's not saying there's nothing we can do. It's not saying we can't act in ways that are profoundly effective. It's just saying that the first thing to realize quite what a deep predicament we're in, quite how hard it is. Because if you listen to descriptions of the climate crisis, there are stories to be told of, rapidly lowering costs for renewable energy, and a lot of action and motivation in civil society, going up the scale of most important political issues, a new president in America, yada, yada, yada. You can tell the story of how this might be turning around now. But when you start thinking about the population and the drive for higher living standards throughout the world, and what we take for granted as normal life, and then you look at the low-hanging fruit that we can deal with in terms of electrification and things, but the tough stuff, the really hard stuff on climate change, requires a kind of change of lifestyle, a change of what we're living, and that means a change of what we're living for, right? And that means, who are we? That's where it gets into the spiritual question. So superficially, it's a technical, scientific, and then political issue, but the political issue quickly becomes a social and cultural issue, and the social and cultural issue is also a psychological and spiritual issue. So it's not one thing or the other. I'm not saying do X, Y, or Z. I'm saying see clearly what this is. It's a multifaceted predicament that we're all caught up in.
Yeah, it's this is something that has seemed to be a common theme over the past year on my podcast. I came to you through Vanessa Dillon, who was the producer of the Divided Brain documentary, which I think taps into a lot of what you're saying in terms of how our focus maybe has been hijacked at a neurological level even. And it's just an interesting topic about how our society has maybe begun to over-rely on science and forget about the spirituality or the needs of people, the need for relationships, seeing the bigger picture.
So here's how I put it, Eric. It's like, it's like the importance of backing up. It's like you begin the question like, what do we do about, and it doesn't have to be climate change. It could be, what do we do to save democracy? What do we do to deal with smartphone addiction? What do we do to reduce income inequality within countries? What do we do about systemic racism? What do we do about the gap between the North and the South? Whatever your big question, when you begin to ask it, it's important to orient yourself in the right way. This is where the chess analogy is quite useful, because ultimately you have to make a move and you have to make a decision, and that requires not doing some things and doing something else. But to get to that right decision, you have to see the position as a whole, and you also have to see the opponent's counterplay. So it's not enough to say, here's a great idea. You also have to mobilize, here's how the other sides will see it. Here's how the competing perspective will see it. And so really what this is a call for, if you ask it, in a general sense, it's a call for a different way of viewing the world, a different form of perception, a different kind of consciousness. Now, you can't wake up and make that happen. It's not like running in the park or lifting some weights or, seeing a therapist. And in a sense, you're open to the critique there of being lazy, because it's like if you call for everything to be changed, nothing will be changed, right? So I'm quite conscious of that. You have to begin somewhere, but it's just good to first of all see clearly.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And I think the reaching after solutions actually gets in the way sometimes of seeing what's really going on.
Do you think that there's a shift happening of seeing these problems more clearly, or are we still fumbling in the dark a little bit?
So both. Both. So yeah. So in what sense do I mean both? Well, first of all, the we in your question is a complex issue in itself, because of almost, almost 8 billion people, I would say, a significant number of them are living in a fairly hand-to-mouth kind of way. Then a large number are doing a little bit better than that, but still extremely busy and almost never thinking of bigger than self issues, just trying to get through the day. And then those who maybe do have time to think about bigger than self issues, people maybe running businesses or high up in corporations, they may have different value sets. They may want to succeed in terms of the game of the world as it is now, sometimes called game A, just like be successful, get a bigger job, get a bigger income, get a bigger house, get more love from the world. And that's it, you've made it. Like, some people still want to do that. So then when you get to a much smaller number of people who are thinking, okay, things are looking pretty serious at an existential level and an ecological level, what are we going to do about it collectively? Now, that we has its own issues, right? That we has its own challenges. But if you ask me, are we getting there? What I'd say is that some people are kind of waking up and some people are beginning to discern different ways of living. But some of them are still living the same life. I'm one of them. I'm caught up in a Western lifestyle, and I'm not claiming any kind of moral leadership as such, just an awareness of how lost we are in these patterns. And then there are other people who are not there yet, and who think everything's going to be fine and technology will fix it. And it's not for me to say they're necessarily wrong, but my intuition is that they're too optimistic.
Yeah. Well, I guess the awareness is the first piece in the ladder, the first rung in the ladder of getting to where we need to go, right? It's
it is, and yet it's a strange injunction, right? Because it doesn't happen by itself. So I mean, if you think of some kind of analogy, I don't know, maybe the Karate Kid as a cultural reference, or I'm thinking of some kind of reference where someone appears and the teacher sort of knows they don't see things properly yet. But you can't just Star Wars even, yeah. I mean, there's many, even well, there's so many, but in essence, any situation where someone hasn't quite got the lie of the land, hasn't quite seen what's going on, their values are not quite aligned or consistent, and their desire is not matching their actions, and then they meet someone, they go through something, they grow, and they come to understand how to live. So this doesn't happen quickly, but what's interesting is when you realize that is the primary aim, that's actually an educational injunction in disguise. That's a way of saying, look, if that's what we need at scale, like, let's make that happen institutionally and culturally, and that becomes policy. So it's not as though these things are disconnected. It's just that the linkages are often quite subtle and hard to discern.
Yeah, there seems to be a lot of opposing forces, I guess you might say. And when I think of the ecological problem, you mentioned policy and education. So one is from the top down, policy is coming from the top down, education is more of a bottom up. But we really need both of those to be working in tandem, right? And the thing that is maybe difficult with the ecological crisis is that it does require people to make certain sacrifices. It does require giving up old ways of living, like you've kind of been talking about. How do you view those two things working together, and is it possible to get them on the same page?
So there's two things there. I could mobilize a response now and make it sound like I know what I'm talking about. But and this is very important, honestly, I think it's a huge conundrum, a bit beyond any of us to really understand. There's two ways of looking at this. One is, well, there's always more than two, but there's two that I want to mention now. One is, look, understand the problem very deeply, look at it at a very high order of complexity and abstraction, look at all the different streams, the sociological, the economic, the political, the epistemic, the spiritual, the psychological, the financial, get them all together and tell a story of their beautiful integration, and then find a kind of acupuncture point that says, if we just do this, we would just have universal basic income and land reform and home-built renewable energy and school that goes on for the whole life and 1 day a week when you're volunteering and yeah, that's your policy proposal. It will work everywhere. No, it won't. Like, it might sound good on paper, but you then encounter reality. And you have places like where of authoritarian leadership, like China and Russia, for example, where they're not going to quickly get on that bandwagon. They've got their own agenda, and that's true around the world. People are caught up in what they're doing. So I don't think it's easy to prescribe any given course of action. What all I can hope for is that enough people in enough places, or a sufficient number of people in a sufficient number of places, demonstrate alternative ways of living and being, and show that it's somehow better fitted to the challenges of our time, and others start to join them. Now, do I know what that means? Part of me thinks it might mean, small communities building new micro-civilizations. But do I really believe that's going to happen at scale? No. And then another part of me is kind of sympathetic to the eco-modernists who say, look, the only way out of this is to double down on the same pattern of progress that we've had for many years, and trust in our technology and keep growing the economy and hope that the technology somehow deals with the kind of problems it's created. I don't know if that's going to work either. Another part of me thinks we need to get away from economic growth as an overall objective. So honestly, Eric, I'm pretty confused, but it's a confusion that arises from thinking about it quite a lot rather than not at all. So I don't have a quick, let's do this. But I do think that when you look at the world's problems as a whole, there is something about finding your own emotional response to that that's precious. Like find a way to feel your way into what's going on that gets you beyond despair, but gets you out of naivety as well. Yeah.
You mentioned that you feel as though you're still caught up in the Western way of living. You're still wrapped up in that narrative. How do you personally get out, and what can people learn from your situation? You've thought about this problem a lot. I'm sure you've considered changes you could make in your personal life or your day-to-day living that would have a positive impact on the problems you're worried about. What does that look like?
Well, there's a question of what it could look like, and then there's a question of how it is. And this is why I don't want to shirk from just how difficult it is. So, if I were to align my behavior with my understanding better, I would, for example, I wouldn't drink any alcohol. I would exercise much more resolutely. I would almost never fly or fly very little. I would encourage my family not to eat meat and try and, make that happen somehow. I would probably live in a smaller house that had better insulation. But these small-scale behavioral personal actions are kind of important. On the one hand, they're the heart of the matter, and yet they're also a huge distraction from the underlying drivers, which are much more about the political economy and the fact that most of these ecological problems have been compounded in the last, or really they've become much worse in the last 20, 30, 40 years. And therefore, and they're often done by the richest segment of society, which includes a lot of people who don't think they're that rich, but by global standards they actually are. So I don't want to be any kind of paragon here. If anything, I'm part of the problem. Right? I'm living the kind of lifestyle that probably isn't sustainable. And that's difficult to live with because, I've got children. I want the best for them. I have certain habits that I'm used to. I like certain kinds of food, and I like living in a certain kind of place. And, it's not as though the reason I know this is so difficult is because I can see in my own case how hard it is to change. And I'm one of many billion. So I don't have an answer for you, Eric, in that sense. What I can say, though, that's a more positive answer, is that if The Moves That Matter, the book about chess and my life, has a sort of underlying message, there is something about loving and letting go. So there is something dignified and maybe even beautiful about saying goodbye when it's time to say goodbye. And I can't say I've always demonstrated that in all of my life, but I know what it feels like. And I know that in principle, you can live a much simpler life. if that's what you think should be done. Or you can orient your will towards making things happen at a policy level if that's what you think should be done. But I honestly don't, I think we're beyond the situation where you can say, okay, here's the action plan, guys. Everyone do X, Y, and Z. I think the first thing we need is a much deeper reckoning with just how entangled and vexed and confused and contradictory and hypocritical and paradoxical our situation really is. I think that brutal honesty is what we need. So in that sense, I see myself as part of the problem, and I actually don't quite know what to do about it. If that makes sense.
Yeah, that does. It's a little bit of a bummer to hear. I was hoping for the XYZ recommendation.
Right. Well, I know I could give that, but I don't. My point is, it's a little bit facile because in addition to the suggestions for change, we also have these immunities to change, right? We have these commitments that we make, but then we have our competing commitments. So we know, for instance, from studies that most New Year's resolutions don't get to February. They don't even get past January, I think the 12th or something. Because people with the best of intentions say they want to do something. They want to mobilize their better self. They want to achieve something or stop doing something. And then the reality of their habit energy kicks in. And this is where the spiritual work that I wrote about matters, because in principle, spiritual practice is there to help you deepen that discipline and stay more closely in touch with real life. And that's great in general. But at the moment, I'm in a COVID context of homeschooling and getting through the day. And, wonderful if you can sequester yourself and do spiritual practice and then enter the market with open arms, as they say in Buddhism, and give to people. But many of us have very difficult responsibilities, very deeply ingrained habits, and it's just not that easy to change, right? So I don't want that to be like your listeners think, oh, well, what's he saying? We should give up. I'm saying no, but I think you have to really feel that first, really feel the extent of the entrapment, so that the solutions that do arise are sort of true to that situation and not sort of brought in as wishful thinking from the outside.
So you're saying almost priming of oneself for things that will be done down the road? Is that what
what I'm trying to get at is the self-improvement that is being called for has to be based on a proper self-understanding, right? It's not self-improvement and that self-understanding is often not good news. Like, this is what they sometimes say. Self-awareness is not always good news, right? Yeah. because you have aspects of yourself that are not that great. We do tell stories to protect ourselves. We do have defensive strategies to make us feel better about who we are all the time. And there's some of that in the book, you may remember. Like, for me, a lot of the time I wanted to say, I don't regret a single thing about chess, and I did the best I could do, and I leave without any regrets. It just ain't true. Like, the truth is, yes, I was very good, and yes, I could have been even better. And I do almost every day wish I'd pushed a little bit harder. But it's not haunting me. I'm not crippled by the thought. I live a full life. I'm grateful for what I have. I'm grateful for what I went through with chess. But there's something much more deeply rewarding about facing your full self and all its good, bad, and ugly aspects. And from there, when you ask, okay, what can I actually do? So I can run Perspectiva, and I can try and create this organization and bring people together and look at problems the way I think they have to be looked at. But if you ask me to, exercise for an hour every day, maybe I can and maybe I can't. It remains to be seen,
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Yeah, I think everyone listening can relate to that. I'm sure there's plenty of broken resolutions out there, especially with how the year started here in the U.S. I know I broke at least one resolution on January 6th.
Right. Which was what exactly? I mean, I know what happened on January 6th, but what did you do that day?
What did I do? I drank.
You drank, okay. Fine.
Yep.
I guess you weren't alone, I guess. But
no.
I don't know. I guess I'm trying to sort of, I don't want people to think that I'm saying, look, everything's in flux, everything's in chaos. and that's just the way it is. I do quite determinedly believe in trying to build a better world. I really do think that we have to find a way to get beyond critique and into vision and into aesthetic judgment about what's beautiful and conviction about what's true and discussions about what's good. And I'm all for that wholehearted endeavor to build a better world together. And I do think it does start at home to some extent. We do have to reckon with ourselves. I guess all I'm trying to say is, in my experience now of reckoning with oneself and the predicament we're caught up in, it's a lot of work. It's not a hints and tips kind of terrain.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It reminds me of a chapter in Jordan Peterson's book, 12 Rules for Life, where he talks about cleaning your own room and how you can't tell other people their room is dirty or try to fix, other parts of the world if your room is a mess. And I think that speaks to what you're saying.
It does to some extent. So I don't know if you know this, but I encountered Jordan Peterson and interviewed him. And actually, maybe you can share it in the show notes. But I wrote a long essay. I wrote a long essay about meeting Jordan Peterson and trying to make sense of him, because it's true that he says, stop talking about climate change, go and clean your room, more or less. And there's something in that. And I actually went through quite a challenge with my kind of community, because I'm my political views are varied, but I'm relatively progressive on most things. And when I got quite interested in Jordan Peterson and started sort of defending him in a certain way, there was a lot of pushback. People thought this is a kind of misogynist, reactionary, old-time conservative, just another typical white man who thinks he knows best. Why are you giving him any attention? And I was like, well, there's a whole sort of worldview that he's bringing to bear that people are very excited about, that is completely lost in mainstream liberalism or mainstream progressivism, namely the inner life and the longing for something transcendent. And Peterson, at its best, was bringing that to bear. However, it's also true, I would add, that what Peterson doesn't ask when he tells you to tidy your room is, who owns that room? What the things that are in it, what system are they part of? What do they reinforce? What kind of forms of cultural reproduction do they represent? Because Peterson's very good at the interiority of the psyche and getting the self to act, but he's sociologically almost blind. He doesn't understand, I think, social and economic patterns that actually shape the self, shape the psyche, and constrain it in various ways. So I think he's, on one hand, very brilliant, and I can understand why people are very excited by him, but I also feel he missed a great deal. So yeah, that's an aside, but
yeah,
he's right to say clean your room, figuratively and literally and metaphorically, but don't stop there. Don't think your work is done. That's maybe a place to begin, but also if your room is messy, I think his point is not so much you have to clean your room and everything has to be spick and span. It's more look closely at what you're bringing to the game. Look closely at who you are. Yeah.
Does this? So I just want to make sure I have what you're saying correctly. So you're saying in an extreme case, Hitler having a clean room isn't actually doing the world any good.
The H word always makes things difficult, but but I would say the problem is a little different from that. So it's that it's not clean your room. It's not clean your room instead of talking about social problems. It's clean your room and talk about social problems, right? So it's a move from an either or to a both and, right? So it's not wrong to say start where you are, know yourself first. But often we can only really know ourselves through forms of political activism, right? If you really want to know yourself, you need to know your social self as well as your psychological self and your spiritual self and your biological self for that matter. So it's not like one or the other. Nothing simple about this. So yes, clean your room, but ask what's in that room. How did it come to be that way? What are the what are the patterns of property and exchange and economic activity that are implicit there that actually are symptomatic of the world outside? And think about that too, right? So I'm not saying don't do one thing, do the other. I'm saying do both and understand how they're connected.
Right. It gets to that having a broader or more complex view, understanding the complexities of the world we live in and our place in it, right?
Yeah. Yes. Exactly. And that's I can tell you that the move towards that is somewhat painful, because you have to sort of leave sight of the shore a little bit. You have to get lost, and I think chess helped me with that, because you cannot help but make mistakes in chess. Like even the very best players make mistakes all the time. And yet you can still win games, and you can still make good decisions, and you can still have beautiful ideas. And so I think for me, it encourages complex thought, because you're not doing it under the pretense that you're always right about everything. You're just trying to generate good ideas, and it's not about avoiding mistakes. It's about expanding the scope of the possible.
Mm-hmm. That seems like a serious challenge today, expanding the scope of the possible. People aren't extremely open to the entire scope of possibilities when talking about contentious issues.
Yeah.
I wonder how you view that.
It's a good way of framing it. And I think we have a crisis of imagination, to be honest. I think we really struggle to see beyond life as we know it. So, the world of individuals and jobs and households and governments, and then the kind of social fabric of that, of parks and mountains and all the things that we take as just being the way the world is, they're also constraints on our imagination for how it could be. So, the 9-to-5 job, for instance, is it's entirely artificial construct. It's become something normal, but in and of itself, there's nothing about it that's normal. The nuclear family, or many of these things that we take for granted as axioms of the world, are not necessarily serving us well. There's an open question about how we should live together. What's the optimal size of a community? Do cities make sense anymore? When you have the internet, why do you need the city exactly? I mean, I ask that provocatively, but if the purpose of the city is to bring people together in one place, I'm not saying there aren't other good reasons for that, atmospherically and efficiently, and all sorts of reasons why you would do that. But the digital world being quite what it is, it's not obvious we have to live and work you have to work in the city and live in the suburbs and endure that commute. Millions of people do. Like, that way of life might just be ridiculously stupid. I'm not saying it is. I'm just saying that's the kind of thing we have to question. But it's difficult to question it because we live through it and we can't even see it somehow. We're like fish in water that can't see what we're caught up in.
Yeah. And things are changing at such a fast pace. I mean, technology changed so rapidly that it seems as though we're just always grappling with the next thing to come out, as opposed to taking a step back and looking at how the things that we've already created are affecting our world. That's something I always think about, is like, I wish someone would just be like, okay, no new technology for 10 years. We're going to figure out what's going on with everything we have. It's a little overwhelming sometimes.
It is. You're right. And technology to some extent drives history. I mean, that's, and it's happening quite fast. And there's a sense of which, technology is ideally tools that we use to shape the world for our own ends. But we don't want technology to be shaping lives in such a way that we can only live in accordance with those technologies, which is increasingly how it feels. I would say, though, that as a sort of slightly more upbeat note, the idea that technology is running wild is sometimes overstated. There are those who say that technologically we've made a great deal of progress in the kind of microchip and the kinds of technology that make smartphones work. And artificial intelligence is rapidly developing. But your airplane of today is almost exactly like your airplane of 50 years ago. And there's a sense in which the story of, there's a lot of failed startups in technology who their ideas don't get off the ground. So I think we often, again, it's this thing about getting stuck in the narrative. it's true that some kinds of technology are moving very fast, and it's also true that the way they combine might be unimaginably different. So if you take AI and synthetic biology and cryptocurrency and what else would we add into that mix? Virtual reality and social media, and stir up the pot and like see like what kind of hybrid organism arises from that. It can seem like life is beyond our control. I agree with that, but I think it's good to remember that these things are sometimes overhyped, and life is in many ways quite similar to how it was as well. So yeah.
Yeah, I guess my main reason for saying that was thinking about social media and thinking about how the market and just the way the economy works, it demands, profit, and it demands these things to scale quickly. It doesn't really care about looking at how, there's no one saying, okay, we're going to let Facebook exist for 5 years. We're going to do a study on how it affects people. There was none of that. It was, how can we make money? How can we benefit the shareholders? And that drives the growth of these things.
Yeah. It's totally out of control. It's totally out of control. I forget the exact quotation, but there's a British philosopher called John Gray, and I think he has a line like, "The world is a vast unsupervised laboratory in which a million experiments are simultaneously underway." And I think that's in an article in the New Statesman magazine. But I think that's true and difficult for people because we want to feel that someone's driving the bus, someone's in charge, and they aren't. The world is radically out of control, and it has all these unintended consequences and deleterious effects that, California being on fire or Australia being on fire, or sea level rises wiping out small low-lying states, problems with food production, pandemics. We are in this time of consequences where things are really turbulent. What do we do? Well, yeah, like you, I wish there were the sort of grown-ups would appear and say, okay, children of planet Earth, you've got a little bit out of control. It's time to sort of dial it down a little bit and remember why you're here and try to live peacefully and happily together. But I don't see how that's going to happen. So
we need the alien invasion quick.
Well, maybe, yeah, you laugh, but I mean, it's an interesting thought experiment, actually. Mm-hmm. I mean, and just to play with that a little bit more, if a benign alien invasion were possible, what would you want them to do? If they were really powerful, presumably we don't want them here as our overlords forever. But if you wanted them to make a few changes, like what would you? If they came to you, Eric, and said, Eric, you've run a very thoughtful podcast for a little while. You've spoken to these people. I need to know what we should do with this planet, which seems to be going crazy. What do you say to them?
I would say, is it possible to wipe greed out of the heart of humans?
Right. Well, interesting, right? Because greed, of course, one of the three evils in Buddhism: greed, hatred, and delusion. And greed is a big problem. Yeah, it's a huge part of it. Hatred also manifests on social media as all kinds of vilifying the other side. And of course, there's echo chamber effects, which mean that you see the other side and you love to hate the other side and so forth. But then there's also delusion, which I think is deeper. And I would say, yes, let's get rid of greed. I would also say, what can you do about delusion? And I think hatred too, like, what would it mean to love the other side, to love not the other side, there are many sides, but to be more generous in spirit to those who cross your path. But yeah, it's tricky because we have this, if you back out, you have this planet Earth twirling in some kind of galactic trance to the tune of the sun, the only habitable planet, as far as we know, within that solar system, Elon Musk notwithstanding. And then beyond that, who knows? There's a big debate about how likely it is that there's anything like planet Earth around. But I mean, it's really precious, right? This life that we have here, it's possible, not necessarily likely, that we're the only civilization of this kind in the entire universe. It's conceivable that's the case. And therefore, it would be tragic if we were stupid enough to destroy it, destroy the conditions of habitable life for human beings. But it does look an awful lot like that's what we're doing. And not because we're unaware, like we know we're doing this and we can't seem to help ourselves, right? Mm-hmm. Now, I hope that that's not how it unfolds and that we come to our senses. But, it remains to be seen.
Mm-hmm. Is Perspectiva more focused on how these problems are interacting, or is it looking for solutions?
So both, I think. So our tagline is systems, souls, and society. And that's quite deliberate. We have the feeling that if you can simplify the complex issues of the world to three main patterns, they would be systems as a whole, a systems view of life. So that would mean everything from biological systems, ecological systems, to economic systems and political systems. So a sort of view of the world as a kind of relational phenomenon of interaction that happens almost objectively by itself, right? But you've also got the world of interiority, the world of the soul, the world of the psyche, the world of identity and longing and consciousness and love and beauty, arguably. And then you have the world of wrestling with how social life, so society, how we talk about these things together. So systems, souls, and society is roughly kind of the perspective of the world from the sort of scientific viewpoint, the perspective of the world from a more spiritual viewpoint, and the perspective of the world from a more cultural or sociological viewpoint. And we think, yes, you have to have the conversation where those things are all there together. And that's what's it's not easy to do that. It can very easily get confusing and complex, but we feel that's the next level of complexity that we have to get towards. So Perspectiva is trying to have conversations at that level of complexity. We don't always succeed, but that's the aim. And that's reflected in the nature of the books that we publish and the activities we undertake. But we're also not just a talking shop. We're not just trying to show how to think about these things, although that's one of our big aims. We've also designed a few different, practices to show how we might begin to do this. So this coming year, we're launching a program called the Anti-Debate, which is about trying to improve the practice of debate and find some kind of mid-form between dialogue and debate. So you don't lose the spectacle and excitement of people competing, but you don't get lost in this hysterical polarization either. And somehow you have the energy of that combat to bring out the best in each other. But you're also, the best in that context is to deeply understand each other and to be awarded for that too, or scored or evaluated on that basis. And we're trying to model different ways of doing festivals, different ways of writing books. And we also have a kind of social network arm called Emerge, which has got a different website. But that's kind of trying to build the social movement around this kind of way of seeing the world. So we're busy, and it's new, and so it can look a little bit unclear how it connects with the world as it is sometimes. But there's a lovely line by Buckminster Fuller about not getting lost in trying to critique the world as it is, but rather building the alternative. And we're not that grandiose. We're just a few people trying to make our way in the world in some ways. But our attempt is to show a different way of looking at the world, a different way of conceiving and building it. And yeah, we hope others, there are others who are doing something similar, and we try and work together with them. But there's a critical mass of people now thinking at this level of redesigning civilization almost while living in it.
Yeah.
So it's like trying to sort of rebuild a spacecraft while you're up in space. It's not easy, but yeah.
Yeah, the anti-debate is a really interesting thing to me, because I think that the lack of reasonable and compassionate dialogue is one of the biggest problems driving a lot of our issues, at least politically here in the United States. And, on one hand, you have debate where you have two sides representing their perspective and making good points. But there's that lack of compassion that is just completely lost through that form of or I don't know if you'd call that dialogue, but through that form of spectacle, perhaps.
So I agree. And I don't know if you wanted to say more, but yeah, I agree totally about that.
Well, I was just going to say, and then on the other side, you have kind of the more Socratic dialogue. I don't know if you're familiar with street epistemology.
A little. Tell me more. I think I might know what you mean.
So it's a form of dialogue practice. I think it was first introduced by Peter Boghossian. Might be butchering his name. But it's also practiced by this gentleman named Anthony Magnabosco. And he has a YouTube channel where he interviews random people on the streets, asking them about their core beliefs and doing nothing but asking questions to help them understand what their beliefs are based on. I actually just interviewed him for the podcast as well, which is really exciting. But what I was going to say is you have these kind of two extremes. One, the debate where there's no compassion or understanding for the other perspective, really. You're just trying to score points. And then you have his, where he's not making his case. So you get the lack of that other perspective. And it sounds like the anti-debate is trying to land somewhere in the middle there.
Yes, you could say that. So it's still in development. So and we actually have given ourselves some time to develop it, because we think designing a new social and epistemic praxis, will take time. It's not obvious what it should be yet, and we need to think it through. But what I would say is that dialogue, when it's done well, is a beautiful thing, and people almost flow into each other, and you feel alive, and it's intimate, and it's humanizing. But it's not always easy to scale it. It's not always easy to find forms of dialogue that everyone wants to watch. It's not necessarily exciting, or it's not necessarily a spectacle. So yes, there's a place for dialogue, and there's also a place for debate properly understood. But what seems to have happened with debate is that it's become more about winning and playing to your own crowd and finding attack lines that stick and they get reported on in the news, and trying to strawman the opponent's arguments so that you can get a powerful argument in there that pleases your crowd. When you're actually trying to really understand something, you try and represent the opponent's view at its very strongest, so much so that they even begin to see it more clearly themselves because of your contribution. But I'm not one of these people who thinks that all competition is bad. I think there's something quite noble and beautiful about competition properly understood. And that's something I write about in The Moves That Matter as well, because chess is a very competitive endeavor, and there is a sense in which by trying to attack the opponent's king, you are trying to kind of kill them. It's sublimated violence, but there is aggression in it. And I think that's part of being human too. So yes, there's the kind of love and empathy and compassion of dialogue, and we need that. But I don't think it would be right to disavow the qualities of expansive, conquest, or the desire to really excel oneself, and the opponent is there to help you excel yourself. So in the context of the anti-debate, the challenge is, can these things coexist? Can you have competitive collaboration or collaborative competition? It's a paradoxical hybrid, and we don't know yet how it will look, but we think our early experiments suggest that it might well work. And what you're competing for, though, is not so much substantively that your side will win. What you're being awarded for is your epistemic prowess, if you like, your capacity to really see clearly. And that includes everything from representing the opponent's view at its strongest, but it's also how well you wield metaphor, how imaginatively you can represent alternative views, the quality and vividness of your examples, the capacity to persuade the crowd, but also to for the crowd to feel they've learned in the process. So there's a lot going on in terms of what we decide to award and how we create a practice that honors all of that.
Mm-hmm. Well, I look forward to hearing more about that for sure. That sounds very interesting.
COVID has slowed it down because we wanted to do most of it offline, of course, but it will develop this year at some point.
Yeah. And I think people do enjoy, I mean, the mainstream media loves having these kind of vicious talking shows where there's people yelling across each other. But I there's podcasts like Joe Rogan's is a great example of people have a genuine hunger for a sort of curiosity and wanting to understand a perspective that might be outside their normal scope of interest. And, those go on for 3+ hours. And
yeah. I that's one of the things that gives me some hope that people do tend to have appetites for quality and depth and understanding and empathy, and there is a kind of I think I heard the expression mass intelligentsia now. So it's not that the intelligentsia is any more kind of few professors who beam in from the television show and tell you what's what. Now people are educating themselves at a very rapid rate on all sorts of things. And that's encouraging, because the sort of kinds of complex understanding that we need and emotional rapport and depth that we need is also being cultivated in a certain number of people. So I just wish that would manifest institutionally, so that, without destroying it, of course, so that education systems began to orient towards that kind of way of understanding. There's some signs of that, but it's not quite there yet.
Yeah, that's something you talk about in your book about, I think, about how education needs to be more about instilling a understanding of learning, a more epistemic type of process, as opposed to a rote memory type of thing. And I don't know how that changes.
I mean, I do think that when you look deeply enough at the myriad problems the world faces collectively, and then you ask, what on earth are we going to do about this? If it was one word, it would be education, right? But the problem with that word is that when people hear education, they think school, and they think, I don't know, they might think chalkboard, or they might think chairs and desks, or they might think teacher or curriculum or head teacher or school bell or lunch hall or whatever suddenly your mind evokes all of these things about education. But education at its heart is about building human capability. And the question we have is the kind of capability gap between what humans are today and what we need to become to survive and thrive in the 21st century. And that gap is something that we can, to some extent, teach ourselves, but really we should have a society that orients towards that endeavor. So rather than being education for the economy, it's more like the economy is for education. That's the kind of shift that we need to see happening. And I wrote about that in an essay on Bildung. Bildung is a kind of Germanic or Nordic notion relating to transformative civic education. In other words, it's a kind of education throughout the lifespan that's about coming to know oneself, the encounter I mentioned earlier. But also what gives it a bit of spice is its self-understanding in your historical context. So it's not just some random psychological growth. It's like, who are you in your current context? What questions and problems are you caught up in? How do you need to grow to deal with them better? And then how do you find the resources in your society to help you do that? That's more like the kind of education we need to move towards.
Again, broadening the scope of vision for what.
Yeah, but I don't want. Yeah, but it's interesting. It's funny you say that now, because as you said it, I was conscious of myself doing that, and I forget who it was now, but I was having a conversation with someone, and I did this a couple of times, and they said to me, "Okay, you've used 2 of your 3 zoom out cards. You're only allowed 1 more, right?" So I'm all for zooming in too. I just think it's if there's a problem, there's not enough zooming out, and maybe I overcompensate for that. But I think having the confidence to keep on asking, why are we doing this? What is this? How can we make sense of this context more fully? What are the layers of context here? What's in the situation? If the question is in the pandemic, yes, there's a kind of biological phenomenon, but clearly there's a social phenomenon, there's a psychological one, there's a governmental one, and many more. And you have to begin to see how these things relate to each other. And the point is not to just get high on perspective or complexity. Like that's not where I'm at. I want discerning action. I want people to know what they're doing so that when they act, it's from a place of conviction based on full context. So,
that makes sense. It's while you were speaking, I just had the thought of the conspiracy theories that are rampant here in the US, especially about, QAnon, of course. People seem to be hungry for context and answers, but they seem also to be very willing to get swept up in these crazy narratives. And I wonder if that's just a result of them feeling as though everyone in charge is dishonest, or what that comes from.
Well, I'm reminded of something this hadn't come to my mind before, but just when you were asking, the image that mobilized is quite a famous study of young chimpanzees, when they were given a choice between food and love. Now, this is the kind of experiment that no doubt has been critiqued, but I still remember it. But basically, there's a kind of fake mother monkey that gives them a certain amount of warmth and connection, almost like hugging a teddy bear. And the hungry monkey can go for the food or they're deprived of love as well. They tend to go for the love, right? So why do I start the answer with this somewhat unusual image? It's because I think if you think about the kinds of people who are susceptible to QAnon conspiracy theories, they're often people who've been looking for connection and understanding and belonging for decades, and been deprived of it. So some of them are thugs, some of them are gullible, some of them are insane even, but a lot of them are just desperate, longing for that sense of connection, in the same way that a chimpanzee would prefer to go for love than food. In the same way that a lot of these people, they're so longing for that connection that if something makes sense, this grand conspiracy theory that seems to have the texture of a explanation of things, you can sort of see why they'd buy into that, and then they defend it, and they'd find all sorts of reasons to justify it. I think it arises fundamentally from a kind of longing for things to make sense in a world that increasingly doesn't. You have to make in some ways we have to make the truth more interesting, I think. Yeah.
Or more truthful. I don't know.
I don't know. Well, this is the thing. You see, I think there's a kind of, there's a challenge with the truth. The whole. So I don't know if you say it in the US, but in the UK, when you give testimony in court, you at the beginning you say, "I promise to give the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. So help me God." Right? Mm-hmm. Or maybe I've imagined that and you do it in the US and not in the UK. But anyway, I've seen it enough to know it happens. Yeah, it happens. But that statement, the whole truth, is very interesting, because lots of things are the truth and nothing but the truth, but not the whole truth. And that's a bit of a problem in this social context, because a lot of what I'm talking about is trying to get at the whole truth. But you can actually have things that are partially true. So to give an example from the UK, like, for example, it's true that Donald Trump was, not this election, but the previous one, true that Donald Trump was democratically elected, right? But is it the whole truth? Well, he didn't win the popular vote. So it's sort of true and not true at the same time, right? Is it nothing but the truth? Well, maybe there was some kind of collusion or corruption, and maybe it's not entirely clear if he necessarily won. And so is it nothing but the truth? Well, can you be sure? I'm not sure. I guess I'm just saying this because the truth is always contested, And in some ways, it's not the truth as such you want. What you want is the spirit of inquiry after truth, the honest, wholehearted, conscientious desire to reach the truth. Those fall in line. This is the truth. That's crypto. That's kind of the beginning of fascism, right? So you want instead this kind of longing for things to make sense and move towards truth, but not necessarily truth as such.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense to me. Well, Jonathan, we're nearing the end of our time here. Is there anything you want to add? I feel like we covered some good ground. Is there anything you feel compelled to say?
I don't think so. I would love it if some of your listeners got to the moves that matter and could let me know what they think about it, because it's been over a year now since it came out, and COVID has prevented me from maybe going places to talk about it and things like that. And it is very much a book for everyone, and that's really all. I'd be very grateful if they could consider it and see if they can see the connection between chess and these wider self-development and social issues that we've spoken about. But beyond that, no, it's been a pleasure, and we've kicked the ball around quite a bit.
Yeah.
And yeah.
Well, I really appreciate your time, Jonathan. And this was a blast for me.